Hi, I'm Krista. I'm the poetry editor of Sand, and I'm joined here with one of our fabulous contributors who has graciously agreed to do a one-on-one discussion with me. Um, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm Rukmini. I am a page and performance poet, originally from Houston, Texas. And thank you to Sand for giving my work a home.
Fabulous. So my co-editor Emma and I have put together some questions for you, and I'll just go ahead and start. We really admired the space of your poem on summer days when they're gardened, and it got us wondering about how you conceptualize your work as it develops and what your writing process is like.
Right, so I think this poem started in a very complicated place. My relationship with my mother is complicated. And it's very tied into my concepts of femininity, and especially as an Indian American woman, what I think it means to be a mother. And so I think I was cooking actually for my grandparents, and I was looking out, and we have just started this garden. And you can see the tomato plants are just beginning to flower, and it made me think about like the way that like a garden provides, right? And then the ways in which it also like it begins and it ends, and it has these like cyclical patterns, and it has so much life, but it also contains death. And gardening was something that I did with my mom a lot when I was younger, and so I think I started the poem from that place of like confusion and a little bit of chaos, and I saw something that made me feel like some clarity, the little like, bright yellow flower on the tomato plant, and I kind of went from there, and it kind of spiraled out of that place.
Oh, that's a beautiful beginning. Like very, very experientially based. That's really lovely. Also, okay, so the next question I have for you is you edited your work after we accepted it, and so it sort of underwent a transformation which made two versions of this poem which were very unique from one another, which got us to wondering what is it like for you to edit your work?
Yeah, I will say that the editing process was something that I felt really deeply that I had to do, because I felt like there were things in the poem that I had maybe glossed over or stated somewhat vaguely that now I have some not more clarity on and more depth in, like crevices kind of that I needed to pull things out of. And I think in that process and trying to draw out my real truth, I ended up creating something that was new and a little bit more grotesque and maybe a little bit more monstrous than what I originally had. It certainly was not an edit that was done with any kind of like formal intention, or I didn't read the piece and say, oh, like I think technically this could be a little bit more smooth here, or I think this could be a very interesting juxtaposition here. It was very much I was reading the piece aloud to make a video for your magazine, for your journal, and I said there's more here that I need to express, and that ended up being something that was very different from what I had originally. And I think both things are true, and both poems are me, just me at different points in time, and me in kind of different spaces almost.
And I think it's actually phenomenal that we get to experience both versions. The second version you are performing for us, and then the first version will appear in print. So I think it's also really cool to have like this palpable transformation. It ended up like really deepening what you gave to us, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you for your work and time on your own poem. And do you have a sort of a philosophy about like when an edited version of a poem becomes a new poem unto itself? I guess you sort of just spoke about that a little bit, but do you have any thoughts on that? Because I often encounter that also.
Yeah. So I think one of the best pieces of writing advice I've ever gotten was from Denise Smith. I saw them, they were teaching a workshop at, excuse me one moment.
Gesundheit.
I think I'm having some like Florida allergies right now.
No.
But I actually got to experience a workshop that they did at a youth poetry festival called Brave New Voices. And it was a workshop about how to write a poem that you will be writing your whole life. And that is how they described it. They said that there are some poems that you will be writing as long as you write. And that was something that immediately struck a chord with me. It resonated so deeply, and it made me feel valid in like these iterations that we have. And even in Hinduism, which I'm trying to understand more, I'm trying to read more about our scripture to gain a different avenue of connecting with my culture. There's so much about a cyclical nature of things, right? The idea of rebirth, the idea of like dharma and karma, which follows you from life to life. In Hindi, we have this saying like, Hamara saath janam ka saath hai, which means we have been together for 7 generations. So there's this kind of connection that you move with people through all your lives, right? Through all your iterations. And so that has been something that has helped me think about like, these are essentially the same poem to me, but they're just different phases of the poem. And so, yeah, it's a new poem because it ends in a new place and it discovers, I think, a different part of me, but it all comes back to this like this kind of seed, right? This place where all these poems spring from. I hope that answered your question.
That was a gorgeous response. Thank you. Yeah, I guess that like the next question I had for you, you also just kind of answered. You have such an eloquence, but the poem, my next question was, does a poem take on a life of its own? Which it seems like it might.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I think that a poem, you need to support it, right? Like you build this like trellis and this poem is like this little tendril winding its way up, and eventually like it doesn't need the trellis anymore, right? It just exists and it just blossoms without you for the most part. And I think too, like that's something that I've had to really keep in mind, especially in this process, especially like having submitted the original piece, made like some vast edits, and now returned to the original piece. It's like I have to remember that like the poem exists without me and it exists beyond me, right? And that's something that I love about poetry, is that you bring something to the table as a writer and you bring something to the table as a reader, right? Like I may read a poem and I may take something completely different out of it than what the poet was initially writing about, but there's a beauty in that, right? And that is what poetry is, right? So I think someone once told me that like, I think it was Alicia Sotelo actually. She is a poet that I was very fortunate to work with for some time in Houston, but she said that poetry is like seeing a story or seeing truth through a crystal bowl. So it's there, but it's not disguised, but there's a veil around it and there's a beauty about it. And it's not hidden so much as it's made unfamiliar, right? This theme in poetry, this motif of like the surprise and the unfamiliar and the familiar turning into bewilderment, and that allowing you to see something new in what you already knew. So I think that has been very important to me in thinking about like poems, especially old poems or poems that I feel like I've moved away from in some sense, to know that they exist outside of my own capacity to create as an artist.
Oh, yeah, I agree so much with what you're saying. And I think it's also very pertinent within discussions about like visual art as well, and like
Yes.
what it means to like sort of like aggressively seek inspiration versus like this process of waiting and just like allowing it to happen and sort of like surrendering to it. Um, there are lots of ways to go about it, and I think uh, part of what makes it the end result, or maybe not the end result, the whole process so beautiful is the way that you interact with the process itself.
Certainly, yeah.
So you already spoke a bit about gardens and the important role that they've played for you, and how a garden became the stage for the situations and conditions of the poem to play out. And I was wondering if you could talk about like your discernment process in terms of like what if the garden is a stage in which things play out, like how did you make decisions about what was going to happen on that stage?
Right. I'm not sure how else I would describe it, but I don't feel like the garden is a stage so much as the garden is like a starting point. It's like this kind of like, it's almost like a motherland from which like this idea of like femininity and motherhood and like Indianness specifically like comes from for me. Because, you know, here in the United States, like being part of the diaspora, there are things that you don't get in grocery stores or that are difficult or expensive to find. And then there's this incredible practice of like you'll go to a gathering and you'll meet someone and they'll say, oh, like I have a curry patti plant, or I have this specific kind of mint, or I have an Indian basil. And you're like, oh wow, you know, I haven't eaten that in so long, or I haven't been able to find that. And they'll gift it to you, right? They'll give you a cutting and you put it in your soil and then it grows into a plant, and then you have the opportunity to do that for someone else, right? For someone who shares that kind of, and it's something, there's something shared there that's beyond just like a flavor, right? I think for Indian people, the like cooking is so much more than just like the process of creating food and the process of eating it. It's also like very much entwined with like how we share love, right? Or how we like what our love languages are. And then for that to happen here, like thousands of miles away from like where we originally came from, there's this like idea that we are taking care of each other in this way, right? That we're showing up for each other, that we're building a new sense of community and culture that is also reliant on like where we come from and our history and our ancestry, but something that can adapt to the kind of strange and unfamiliar situations that we find ourselves in now. And so I think like some of my best memories are working with my mother in the garden, planting lemongrass, planting, you know, curry patti, planting all this stuff that like then made our food like so flavorful, like not just with like the actual spice or the actual flavor, but with also like this knowledge that like we created this, right? We came from a place and now we've landed in a new place and now we're making space for ourselves here. And I think that that is just beautiful. And the work that I have been able to do with some like urban gardening projects, like that, it blows my mind really, the way that we have been able to take like spaces that were not made for us and make things bloom in them, regardless of how we've had to change or adapt to make that happen.
Wow. That's a beautiful way to put it. I like that you shifted away from like the stage analogy. I think like a starting place is a really beautiful way to put it. And for the next question Emma and I had, we noticed that that motherhood as like a concept or an idea shifts throughout the poem. And you had mentioned before that you have a complex relationship with your mother. And I get through the poem, we noticed that there's like a specific or like a personal mother figure that feels like it could be the speaker's or your own. And then almost like a shifting into more of an archetypal mother. And then you also mentioned like this anticipated role of motherhood that the voice of the poem takes on as well. And so I was wondering if you could expand on that sort of progression or that evolution of the concept throughout.
Yeah, so like I said, my relationship with my mother is complex. There are a lot of things that have gone into making it so, but I think that it's something that I struggle with a lot because there is this standard of motherhood, right? This archetypal mother that is everything that a child could ever want or need, and it places so much burden and so much pressure on like the mother figure to provide, right? To be everything that the child could want and to make sure that all the child's needs are met and then on top of that to teach the child how to love, how to be loved. And then I think about my own experience, not just with my mother, but with all the people who have been mother figures in my life. And I think about like this change from like the broadness of what like the archetypal mother is supposed to provide to the specificity of like what I hold from my mother figures, what they have given to me. It's these specific moments or these specific ways of loving or these specific flavors or specific pieces of advice that I carry with me. One of my poet mentors, Deep Mouton, I think of her very much as a mother figure, and she gave me this piece of advice in regards to poetry where when I first started writing poetry, I was very much caught up in like slam, right? Like performance poetry. Like I had this idea of like who I was gonna be and what it was supposed to look like and what I was supposed to say. And she was like, you need to leave room in your poems for yourself. And like that on one hand was like, right, right. Like on one hand, that was like very specific to the poem that I was writing and the person that I was trying to be. And on the other hand, it's like this like it kind of grew into this huge thing for me where I take that not only into my poetry, but also into my life, right? Into like the relationships that I have with people and the world that I'm trying to create. I'm like, this world has to have space for me and this world has to have space for all of us, right? Like, and so that idea of space comes from her. And so I think that there's something to be said about like the broadness of what we expect from a mother and then the not the narrowness but the concreteness of what we actually get from our mother figures, and that is something that I hope to take into my own relationships and if I ever become a mother to bring that to my children as well.
Mm, thank you. Uh, we, there's so much about this poem that we love, and I, I think you're just doing an exquisite job talking about these things. What I think really specifically, just to talk about one particular line, the sequence of words, fence of our skin, seems to function on so many different levels, and it's near the end of the poem, and so it just like it feels like it's even deepening what's already occurred before in the poem. And so I was wondering what like on what levels those words are functioning for you.
Yeah, so on one hand it's like this very literal thing, right? Like our skin is, if we put our hands next to each other, our skin is what differentiates your hand from my hand, right? At the same time, like I have this very distinct memory of like gardening with my mother and then like looking up at the fence that separated our house from our neighbor's house and like seeing the lizard like just on top of the fence, and beautiful. And like it the lizard, I think that it's his mating call. It has like this part of its throat that like swells out, and the lizard is green but it has this vibrant pink throat, and I sitting on this like dull boring brown fence, and you're like, there's something about that just stuck with me, something there that like resonated with me in terms of like freedom, like making our own space and like thinking seriously about like what boundaries are necessary and like how do we create those in a way that's not exclusive. At the same time, like the fence of our skin is um to me also a representation of like the distance that is created as a child grows up, and as a child, like as I have learn to see my mother as a person and not someone who is a part of me. Because, you know, she always used to say to me and my sister when we were children that like we are all like one person. And ultimately, like, you know, I came out of her, right? So it makes complete sense. Like we exist in like this, you know, solid, like, you know, just this tight knit pack, and that the three of us are just, you know, on a boat and we're riding through this world together. And then, you know, sometimes you get too big for the boat, right? Like, and you're no longer attached to your family in this like very like, you know, physical, visceral way. Like you're no longer bound to them. And then you're like, well, now that, you know, we're separated, what brings us together and what divides us? And so it's also about like my skin is her skin, right? Like those are my genes. At the same time, like our skin is a barrier between us. Like my relationship to hers is also a barrier between us. And there are ways in which we can't speak to each other because of our relationship, because she's my mother and I'm her child, right? So that too.
Yeah, it's such a difficult thing to negotiate, this like deep connection and like empathic response to someone, while yet needing boundaries in order to, like, as you said before, like continue into the world like with your own space. It's a really difficult thing to negotiate, and I think the poem really gets at that. I only have one more question for you. I mean, I could probably ask you question upon question upon question, but the final question is, what are you working on now?
Um, well, first, thank you for allowing me to see into my work more clearly. Your questions have illuminated things for me that I don't think I even realized that I was thinking about or that I was doing. So I really appreciate us having this conversation. Um, Now, I think, yeah, I haven't been working on much, to be honest, because, you know, there's this anxiety around the pandemic and people who are close to us who are at risk, and this mass death that we have not gotten to mourn as a nation at all. And, you know, the killings, the murders of unarmed Black people, and racism, which makes Black people a greater target for the coronavirus, and so much that is weighing so deeply and so heavily in my heart. And I think my energy right now is going into, okay, how do I make this better? How do I fix this? How do I address, you know, anti-Black racism in my own community? How do I, you know, support those and stand in solidarity with those who are protesting and who are being tear gassed and shot at with rubber bullets right now? That is where all my mental energy, my creativity, my anger, all that drives my writing and all the best parts of myself, that's where that's going right now. Hopefully out of this experience, we will create a world that is better than the one that we are seeing right now. That's the only thing I can hope for and work towards. And I hope that in that process, I will also continue to write. But it feels like right now, writing is not my highest priority. My highest priority is to try and ensure a world where the people that I love are safe.
Thank you for answering that. Honestly, I think like we need to hear that, because I think it's really important that we know the reality of what it means to like not be able to like give your attention to something that is really important to you, but like identifying that it needs to go somewhere else at this moment is heartbreaking, because your voice is so important. And so I really appreciate you answering that, and I think it's really important for people to hear, and I hope to see more of your writing too, when it's possible.
Yeah, there is this question that the poet Kaveh Akbar, he mentions often on his Twitter, which is like, what does it mean to be in a nation working in a language and a medium that can produce something like this being racism, social inequity, these deep divides in our country, right? Like, and that is something that, you know, ever since I first saw that, it's been rattling around in my mind, right? Like, and I don't think anyone has an answer to it, but I think it's an important thing to think about, especially in terms of like what's next, right? Like, knowing that English is this way, that America is this way, and that is inextricably tied into me. Like, what can I do to make sure that our future does not look like our past or our present?
Absolutely. Kava Akbar is amazing.
Absolutely, I 100% agree.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rukmini. I so appreciate you taking the time to speak with me, and I'm so pleased to have you in this issue and your work.
And thank you again for being so generous and so kind with my work, and for taking the time to read my poem and to see all that I meant to say and more.
My utmost pleasure.